welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Charles Dashings, and we're talking about everyone's, well, not everyone's actually. A lot of people don't read him anymore. Maybe sort of the founder of existentialism, Søren Kierkegaard, and his implications for, well, the left-ish. Although this one's a little bit harder to parse in regards to what Kierkegaard's actual politics would have been. But Charles, how did you get so interesting in good old Kierkegaard?
Well, while many people in their teens were reading Friedrich Nietzsche, I happened upon Søren Kierkegaard, which was interesting because by the time I reached the so-called age of reason, 14, 15, 16, I was pretty much convinced that theism was false, and I wasn't particularly interested in Christian theology. But suddenly I came across this ostensible Christian thinker writing very powerfully about issues that seemed very important to me or seemed very relevant to my experience. I'd never encountered a philosopher who so eloquently described the experiences of anxiety, of melancholy, of depression, of the search for meaning and the self, and the whole Christian theologian thing didn't really bother me because it seemed what was most important about what he was saying had to do with questions of autonomy, questions of our contingency and historicity. And it just really hit me at the right time because, as anyone who's ever been a teenager knows, it's a time filled with a lot of angst and with a lot of uncertainty and self-discovery. And I found in Kierkegaard a thinker really working through these issues, through these trials of the self.
So, how have you tried to integrate that into any kind of political ethics or political practice? I mean, one of the things about Kierkegaard is he's often seen as a hyper-individualistic philosopher, which I'm not sure if that's totally true, but that is often how he's portrayed. So how do we deal with Kierkegaard in the political sphere?
It's a very interesting question. As far as Kierkegaard's actual politics, I mean, as a young man, he was born basically at the end point of Danish monarchy in the beginning of the 19th century. He lived from 1813 to 1855. And as a young man, he was pretty much a default royalist. I mean, he had an opportunity to hold court with the King of Denmark at the time. But over the course of his life and through the development of his philosophy, he approached something more like what we'd call Christian socialism or Christian universalism. So I think it's a difficult question to map on Kierkegaard's political orientation to the 21st century. Suffice to say that I think any left politics that doesn't grapple with questions of individuality is incomplete. Certainly he was no collectivist. Certainly he, much like Nietzsche, was suspicious of revolutionary movements going on at the time. But there's something in his consistent emphasis on the fact that we are thrown into the world, that we are subject to forces beyond our control, and that we are forced to confront a world seemingly unanchored from meaning, and we're forced to do that on our own terms.
So, I mean, one of the things about Kierkegaard in dealing with his existentialism is that he is a figure like a couple of existentialists that I do figure out how can I phrase this? That I do figure are more important to understand their biography to really get what they're going on about.
Yeah.
I think that's important for Nietzsche. I think that's somewhat important for Sartre, and I think it's very important for Kierkegaard. So can you go into that intersection a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you can't read any of Kierkegaard's works without being returning to a certain fundamental crisis in his life that he kind of explores again and again in various forms and seeks to, through his writing, actually understand and offer an apology for. Really, you could see his corpus as a form of personal apology, as well as a way of coming to terms with a self that he has become that he did not anticipate. The central event in Kierkegaard's life, and which is depicted or represented again and again, is his failed engagement to a woman named Regine Olsen. Kierkegaard pursued Regine Olsen for over a period of 2 years, and it became apparent to him that after his initial period of deep infatuation and love, that he was unsuited uh, to be a husband and a father. So he found himself in the situation where he was deeply in love with this woman, and there would be no other woman for him. Yet he found himself psychologically unsuited for marriage, not willing to make the kind of lasting commitment that marriage requires. So the question for him became, well, what am I to do if my meaning in life is not to be through this marriage to Regine Olsen? What was the purpose of this event in my life? How can I make sense of and rationalize this fact that I have this great love, but this love cannot find expression through marriage? So you can see his authorship as his coming of age as an author, as a poet, as a philosopher, through this primal encounter or failure of being able to marry. And the great mystery for both historians and readers of Kierkegaard is exactly what went wrong. Uh, from Regine Olsen's perspective, it blindsided her. She did not understand at all what happened. In fact, he went to great lengths to try to extricate himself from the relationship in kind of devious ways, frankly. He tried to create a distance between Regine and himself over time by being sparing in his affection, being detached, uh, in the hope that she would break off the relationship. He was unwilling to just say straight up to her, "It's like, I can't do this. I can't explain why." I mean, he intimates to her in various letters that she would be unhappy with him because he has this deep-seated melancholy. Uh, he he's m- he feels that he has a divine mission to be a writer, and these are very strange things to say to a woman you're engaged with and have her like say, "Oh, that makes sense." Um, but he tried through his letters to explain why he suddenly, because it was a bit of an about face, uh, was unwilling to make this commitment. And uh, the methods he used, he perhaps hyperbolically would dramatize, and most famously in his 2-volume work Either Or, where he has this character of the seducer, which he both identifies with and sees as kind of an extreme distorted version of the kind of life he was leading or could have led if he had not had this um, impactful encounter with Regine. And that was primarily a life of aesthetic reflection. In the seducer's diary, which is the main section where we get this idea of the seducer, we have an individual who whose chief pleasure in life is the methodical seduction of women. And interestingly, For the seducer, it's not the point of seduction is not the fulfillment. It's to gradually and meticulously ensnare women into deep infatuations with them. And at the moment where they have them captured, to move on to something else because it no longer is interesting to them. Whether or not this was what was going on with Regine, I think not. I mean, he maintained throughout his life that he was virtually or spiritually married to Regine. He kept, for instance, he kept copies of every book he ever wrote, one for himself and one for Regine, and he kept it in a locked cabinet. So he sees Regine as married to him, not in a finite worldly sense, but in an eternal sense. And he dedicates his entire authorship to her. That I know that's a lot of biographical information, but that's the basic story. That Kierkegaard's authorship can be seen as an autobiographical expression of what this crisis of a failed relationship meant for him and how it leads him to the decisive choice to become an author and how it sustains his authorship.
So, I mean, here we have a philosophy that really seems to develop explicitly as opposed to implicitly out of some kind of primary trauma, to use, modern problematic psychologizing terms.
Yeah.
But it's interesting where Kierkegaard goes with this, because I mean, I know that many Christians, for example, love him, but he's also critiqued by a lot of Christians for effectively rendering Christianity irrational. That's a common critique thrown at him. And the reason why is because faith becomes like an individualist existentialist choice, as opposed to something that is obvious in terms of natural law, a la Aquinas or even Calvin or somebody like that. So this leads us to an interesting development in Kierkegaardian existentialism. In some way, he's the first person to inspire a movement that is largely atheistic, and yet both from personal biographical reasons and his own theological implications, you can't separate his existentialism from theology. And I think that's an interesting kind of thing to square. So, what about his descriptions of melancholia and anxiety do you think really helps speak to you, given that so much of it comes out of theological propositions, but they may not be theological, but they may ultimately be theological? It's actually kind of like Hegel. It's like, when are we being theological and when we're not? It's actually very hard to parse. And Kierkegaard's a similar thinker. He's not like Hegel in almost any other way, but
well, I think he's more like Hegel than he's willing to admit. I mean, we must remember that the intellectual environment in which Kierkegaard was educated in the 19th century Denmark was thoroughgoing Hegelian. I mean, this is someone who had read and reread Hegel very carefully, and the kind of the play of his authorship is this upfront disavowal of dialectics while re-employing dialectics for his own purposes. You can see Kierkegaard grappling with the dialectic, or rather reapplying the dialectic to existence itself. And that is what gives birth to a kind of proto-existentialism, because he sees in at least the Danish Hegelians, and that's important to keep in mind, that he's not necessarily parroting Hegel, but parroting specific Danish Hegelian professors that he encountered. That is the target of his polemic. But you see that his principal criticism of Hegelianism of his day is that it's too abstract. It's proclamations of kind of unifying world history and kind of understanding everything has forgotten a very important point, that there are actually existing people who have to figure out how to live, right? How to live with the place they find themselves in the history of world spirit. So for Kierkegaard, there's a kind of inner development, an inner dialectic of the individual that first has to be grappled with before we go further and start talking about the immanent movement of history. There's an immanent movement of the soul of the individual. So you see in Kierkegaard a kind of absorption and radicalization of the dialectic, or kind of appropriation of the dialectic for the purposes of understanding how we are to be in the world. This is why existentialism in general and Kierkegaard in particular are often seen as philosophers of becoming rather than philosophers of being. They think the task of philosophy begins with the individual in his concrete historical circumstances, working out how he is to live, or how they are to live, what to value, and what to anchor meaning on.
Mm.
And I think there's a second part to your question. I kind of went off on a different note, but what else were you asking about?
I was actually so absorbed in that I was actually kind of lost what I was thinking about.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm thinking about. I mean, Kierkegaard's an interesting figure for me because I mean, I was talking about his theological
Yeah.
orientation and how
Yeah,
he's
how do
like Hegel. But yeah,
how do we square the fact that Kierkegaard has been largely appropriated by secular philosophers? I mean, of course, there's theologians who have found inspiration, but like, what is Kierkegaard's relevance to leftist secularists, which I think the majority, perhaps, of your listeners might be? That's an interesting question, and I think you also asked how his analysis of anxiety and melancholy fits into this, particularly because he sees it or analyzes it in terms of theological categories such as sin and repentance. Um, I think the tendency has been to basically bracket his more explicitly theological statements or conceptions and read him phenomenologically, right?
Mhm.
So what is valid in his analysis of melancholy and anxiety is what it feels like from the inside. Like anyone who has read the concept of anxiety or the sickness unto death will recognize, and who has experienced anxiety and depression will recognize themselves in that. He's a very good psychologist, much like Nietzsche in this way. Now, it's not necessary for us as non-Christians to impute the ontological source of anxiety to sin consciousness like he does, but we can analogize this idea of sin consciousness, and we can certainly see how we have absorbed it in a society that has been so impacted by Christian metaphysics and Christian philosophy, this idea of sin consciousness in our internal experience of anxiety. So we need not
Mm.
call it what he does, but we can see the validity in his penetrating psychological analysis of anxiety, and that's the experience I had as a teenager reading about Kierkegaard's depression. I mean, his writing is suffused with melancholy, and this this is understandable once again when you bring in some autobiographical details. I mean, Kierkegaard was one of two surviving sons and daughters of a very unhappy mismatched marriage. His father was this very imposing, pietist Lutheran figure who mangled his understanding of his body and of sexuality. So there is this repressive element in Kierkegaard that you have to grapple with. That's why he's been so amenable to psychoanalytic readings, because it's not subtext. It's the foreground. So you have to see him as someone who has literally inherited a melancholic disposition, a very severe, very rigid, very Kantian father had terrified the young boy, the young Kierkegaard, in this very strict understanding of the moral law as a divine command. So you have a young man who's simultaneously rebelling against his father, but is psychologically indebted to his father in terms of his overall disposition. He was born into an unhappy family and inherited this unhappiness. And it's through his fundamental unhappiness and dissatisfaction that he's able to be such a prodigiously productive author. He's able to take this, the removal of like any possibility of romantic love and sexuality, and sublimate it into a far deeper contemplation of the inner motions of his self.
Yeah, that's I want to go into Kierkegaard's father a little bit,
Sure.
because I've read a little bit about him, and he seems particularly strange. And I mean, you know, I think maybe it was your show I was listening to, but I think I'd read this somewhere before and not really incorporated it because I hadn't studied Kierkegaard since I was probably 20, to be completely honest.
You want to go into the primal scene?
Yeah.
Yeah. We go ahead.
Go ahead. No, it's just go ahead.
Okay, so the thing you should know about Kierkegaard's father, other than what I've already said, is that this appears to be a man haunted by a tremendous sense of guilt, stemming from supposedly illicit activities as a young man. We don't really know. Perhaps he was a frequent patron of prostitutes, and because of his pietist faith, he felt tremendously guilty about it. He did end up marrying a serving maid. He impregnated a serving maid. This is Kierkegaard's mother, shortly after the death of his first wife. So Kierkegaard is actually sired under very unsavory, unchristian, at least according to their understanding of the faith, circumstances. So there is this tremendous pressure of a burden of guilt or of debt that hangs over his father, and perhaps explains his deep melancholy. But there's a particular incident that was relayed to Kierkegaard by his father that stuck with him his whole life. It's an incident that happened to his father when he was a young man in the hills of Denmark. He came from a shepherding family, and he was stuck out in the hills with the sheep, and it was raining and it was freezing, and he was miserable, and he was just not having a very good time. And he was so frustrated and such resentment of his lowly origins and the fact that he was stuck out here in the cold and wet with these sheep, that there's this moment where he curses God, right? And this seems to be an incident that he never forgave himself for. And Kierkegaard never forgave himself. It's it's hard to put ourselves in this mindset of like, what's the big deal, right? But when you come from this kind of devotionalism, this pietist faith, the idea of even a young man in a moment of like weakness and suffering cursing God is something that can rebound across the generations. And it certainly did for Kierkegaard's father and for Kierkegaard himself. This is kind of a primal scene, not only in terms of inheriting this kind of melancholy or feeling of worthlessness, right? Worthlessness before God, but it becomes a unrepayable debt that the family then internalizes as a curse. I alluded to the fact that Kierkegaard was one of two surviving children. was originally a family of 7, and his 5 other siblings died before reaching the age of 32. And the significance of this is Christ, oh, sorry, 33, the historical age of Christ at the time of the crucifixion, right? So
Mhm.
imagine yourself being this really devotional pietist. This is the background of your thought, and you see all your siblings die tragically at a young age before the age of 33, right? So they interpret this as some kind of divine curse for this primal guilt, this inherited sin of the father's young man cursing gods in the hills of Denmark. And Kierkegaard really believed this. He believed that not only was there a curse or unrepayable debt that he inherited from his father and that had impacted his siblings, that God, instead of, what's the severest punishment God could have brought upon his father? Well, killing his children, right? And Kierkegaard really believed as a young man that he was not long for this world. He thought he would die before the age of 33 because this is a family wrought by tragedy where people keep dying at a young age. And this really spurs his desire to be in a great hurry to become a writer. I mean, this is someone who in 1843 alone publishes Either Or, which is over a nearly 1,000-page book, Fear and Trembling, Repetition, and Four of Building Discourses, which is kind of, he has this segmentation between his more philosophical speculative works and his more conventional sermonizing, right?
Mm.
But this is someone who basically publishes everything he will ever publish, and it's voluminous. And it doesn't even include all his letters and his journal entries in a period of less than 10 years because he's convinced he's going to die. Spoiler, he doesn't. He lives to 41, but he doesn't live a very long life.
I'll say, yeah, he doesn't die when he thought he was gonna die. He gets past his Jesus year,
Yeah,
but not a lot. Like
not a lot. No. I mean, but you have to understand, like, think about like the kind of like strenuous effort involved in writing thousands of pages of both published text and unpublished journals. This is an individual, because of his class position, and this is important. Kierkegaard's father was a merchant, fairly
Mhm.
successful merchant, established a sizable family fortune, which Kierkegaard and his brother largely inherited. Kierkegaard in his youth was a bit of a prodigal son. He was kind of a wayward youth. He didn't know what he was going to do. I mean, this is a story that many of us could relate to. He didn't really know what he was doing. He just kind of was a flaneur about time. He spent a lot of money, a lot of his father's money, on coffee shops, on fancy dandyish clothing, on expensive cigars. He was an individual really living the life he would later dramatize in Either Or as an aesthetic voyeur, just kind of going about, just enjoying the finer things in life. But at the time his father dies, he inherits the family home and a reasonably sizable fortune at the time that he, for the most part, is able to live on until, because of his prodigal spending, which he never really gives up. He's convinced, or he rationalizes to himself, that his spending habits are part of his vocation as a writer. It's necessary, right? He needs to be an observer of the crowd. He needs to get out among the people, have his people baths, and in order to fulfill his mission as a writer. But Kierkegaard is basically someone who lives off of an inherited wealth, and he's not very savvy as an investor. He's not, capitalizing on his existing capital. He's just kind of in this transitional place between a person who works for a living and an actual capitalist who's valorizing their capital. So
Mhm.
this is a way to understand kind of his apoliticism, because he doesn't really have any stake in anything, right? He as a deeply devout Christian, he has a great humanitarian sympathy for the poor. By the way, much of his fortune, and we don't really know how much was just given out to people he knew. People would ask him for money. He would just give it away. But I don't want to make him into some kind of like great like saintly figure who's just giving away all of his money. Like I said, he was spending it on himself as well. But he would never refuse anyone who asked him money, and he gave a lot of his fortune away to the poor. I'm sorry, I'm getting very far afield from your question, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of the kind of person that Kierkegaard was, his class position, and why, to go back to a previous question, why it's difficult to talk about what his politics were in his own time, because he had the luxury of kind of being above it all. And Adorno, very interestingly, I don't know if you're aware that his first published work, his actual doctoral dissertation, was on Kierkegaard, and I believe it's called The Construction of the Aesthetic. And he basically makes a lot of this kind of liminal class position of Kierkegaard, and he uses it to understand why he would be the kind of person to focus on this kind of interior development of the self. He calls it like the bourgeois interior of the imagination, right? It's like, this is someone who, like, you can literally look at where he lived, like the kind of the room he wrote in, and like the view he had from the street. Like, this is what happens when you're kind of in this liminal class position. Where else are you going to turn? You're going to turn inward.
Well, this inward turning is kind of interesting to think about, because on one hand, one of the ironies to think about Kierkegaard is, for someone who's so theologically driven, he mostly inspires an atheistic movement. I mean, existentialism, there are still Christian existentialists after Kierkegaard, but there's not a ton.
There are people like Martin Buber,
right.
Karl Jaspers. These are explicitly religious thinkers. But yes, in terms of the people who are most obviously influenced by this kind of existential ontological turn that Kierkegaard inaugurates, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, there is a kind of atheistic appropriation of someone who set as his task in life becoming a Christian, right? That was the most difficult thing for Kierkegaard. But there's a kind of inherent anti-conventionalism suspicion in this notion, and it's something he would proclaim at the end of his life, that he wasn't even sure that this Christian country contained a single Christian, right? He makes the idea of being a Christian a personal task for the individual, right? It's something that you have to work for, that is actually incredibly difficult, that involves grappling with certain absurdities, and by grappling with them, somehow overcoming the absurdity and believing in virtue of the absurd. He wants to make Christianity difficult again, because he sees that the life of freedom, the task of freedom, is making difficult choices that will determine who you become and the kind of world you live in into the future, and owning those choices.
So one other thing that you see in the existentialists, with the notable exception of Jaspers and Sartre, is a skepticism, if not an outright hostility towards systemization. Now, this is a leftist podcast, and we kind of have the opposite tendency.
Yeah.
Despite all the post-structuralists saying we were going to stop doing that, we very much have not stopped doing that. Yeah. We're system builders par excellence. Do you think that's why Kierkegaard may have been kind of acknowledged, but also semi-ignored in left political philosophy?
Well, I think he's been cast as like an arch reactionary, right? And there are good reasons to kind of put him in this position historically. We've already alluded to it in terms of his kind of liminal class position. He's someone who didn't really have material stakes in the liberation of the working class, and certainly was seemingly aloof to the reality of capitalist exploitation. But I mean, that's something that's less so at the end of his life. But you can see that on not only his class position, but there's historically been this hostility to any philosophy or politics that grounds itself in individuality, right? But I think it's important that we distinguish it between the kind of bourgeois individualism that is critiqued in the Marxist tradition, and the kind of existentialist individualism espoused by Kierkegaard and later by Jean-Paul Sartre. Many people think that it just reduces, bourgeois individualism. This is just kind of an apology for bourgeois individualism, that it emerges from a certain bourgeois individualist standpoint. This is certainly the thesis of Adorno in his dissertation. But I think my framing earlier is correct, that Kierkegaard's hostility to the systemizers, and something hostility shared by Nietzsche, as you know, emerges from this idea that in our mania for systemizing, for comprehending the totality, we elide the fact that we are all individual people. Yes, we are in complex social relations and interdependencies, but we first must grapple with the concrete tasks of the fact that we have to make difficult decisions and choices, and that the choices and decisions we make will impact what kind of future we build. So I think the anti-systemization has to do with what is left out, or what is bracketed in a more systematic approach to philosophy, as opposed to something that's grounded in the concrete individual experiences and motions of the psychological development of the individual. And I think that's important, and I don't think that's just bourgeois mystification or individualism. I think that's something that we all grapple with. It's like, what do I want? What am I willing to do to get it? Am I able to live with the choices involved to get what I want? And if we can answer that question positively, that's part of constructing the kind of, not only the kind of selves we will be, but the kind of communities we will build. So I think
Okay.
the question of individuality is inescapable, and I think it's primary.
So you don't think, for example, that Kierkegaard could be accused of lapsing into something like Hobbesian atomic individualism or atomized individuals? Like, how does relation play into Kierkegaardian thought?
I think there is a kind of existential primitivity. And what I mean by that is that the individual is given a large sway of the individual is conceived as someone who has a tremendous amount of control over the type of person they build themselves into, right? So we have this idea, and it goes back to Plato and Aristotle, that we do exercise a degree of control over our character, right? And for Kierkegaard, the reason we do this is because, and this will be later elaborated by Sartre in a much more explicit way, but I think it's also present in Kierkegaard, is that when we abstract from the big things around us, when we abstract from our community and our society, and we look inward at ourselves, what is there? Nothing, right? There's a nothingness. There's a only pure possibilities, right? Kierkegaard has this idea that the self is essentially nothing, but the infinite play of possibilities that for him, he experiences by going to the theater, right? The theater helps us visualize, helps us in our imagination, possible paths of life, possible ways of living, possible orientations, right? And it's only the only thing that can make a possibility into an actuality is the fact of our choosing, right? The decisions we make, the actions we take. So when we abstract, or we don't start with abstraction, but we start with what we see when we look inward. We see nothing. We see only the play of possibilities. How do we actualize our existence? Well, we actualize our existence by acting in the world, by choosing. We take that nothing and make it into something. That, for Kierkegaard and for Sartre, is the task of freedom. And because it's the task of freedom, it's the essential task that we begin with before we get anything else.
So
does this make sense?
No, it makes sense. It's one of these things where the relationship to politics is both obvious and not obvious simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because there's an ethical demand to this, but it doesn't go in any particular way. And I think we see that in the politics of existentialists, which range wildly across the political spectrum.
Right. If we read Martin Heidegger as an existentialist, it seems like existentialism leads inexorably to fascism. Whereas if we read Sartre as the arch existentialist, we get a kind of more ambivalent politics. But it doesn't seem like we can look at any of these existentialists or proto-existentialists and get a clear leftist politics. So what are we to make of that? Is that the line of thought?
Right. Yeah, although I'd also say I don't think we get a clear politics out of Hegel either, despite people trying to pretend that we do, even though Hegel has explicitly political writings.
Yeah.
So our Kant, if you look at the range of where Neo-Kantianism ended up, and it's also huge from, possibly a relationship to Jacobin thought in France, all the way to arch reactionary neo-Kantians in the early 20th century leading up to fascism. So you have a huge like these German existentialist and idealist philosophers tend to be generative in like wild chaotic ways, even when they're not chaotic philosophers. Although I think Kierkegaard kind of is a little bit chaotic, but
is a bit of a messy bitch, right?
Yeah, I mean, more in some ways, even more than Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche, like I'm not here to replay is left Nietzscheanism defensible, because I think, like, sort of, but Nietzsche is a figure his personal politics and where various Nietzscheans went with it is somewhat hugely divergent. Both people using him on the right and people using him on the left, frankly.
Well, I mean, with Nietzsche at least, I mean, he does. We know that he paid explicit attention to the political developments of his time, and he had various opinions of it. Whereas Kierkegaard, we don't really get any direct political engagement. We don't have someone who seems to be commenting or making note of what the newspapers are saying. I mean, in fact, he has the opposite inclination. He has complete contempt for the press and the media. And we see this to an extent in Nietzsche, but we do see a more serious watchfulness in terms of both like national political events and geopolitical events. And there's not really that in Kierkegaard.
And that's kind of an important thing to notice, right? Like, and that's why I'm like, I can, like, for example, I might defend the idea of a Nietzschean leftist, but still go, but Nietzsche was the arch reactionary kind of, and we all know it. Like, which, like, he's not the worst. I don't think he's a Nazi.
Right.
But he's an anti-liberal in a way that's thorough.
Right. I mean, but of course, like what we have to do with that is like, does his anti-liberalism tell us something important about the limitations of liberalism? that's the move that has been made. And if he's just an anti-liberal, if he's just an arch reactionary, if he's just someone who is easily and perhaps appropriately taken towards more right-wing policies, what's redeemable about him? I think if we read him as an anti-liberal, we have to see him more as a critic of liberalism, and we have to use what he identifies as insofar as it is accurate for a politics that perhaps he would oppose. I mean, do you disagree with that perspective? I mean, if he's valuable, he has to be valuable as a critic of liberalism. He has to show us some shortcomings.
So, and I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to moderate if it ever happens, I haven't even proposed it yet, a debate between Devin and Daniel on
Never
this
happened.
topic. Yeah,
Never happened.
I might make it happen. If anyone
All
can
right.
make it happen, it's me.
Good luck.
I also would like to get the Cuck philosophy guy on too, and some other anti-Nietzschean on.
Yeah.
Just for a brawl. But actually, because I feel, as a person who spent a lot of my life studying Nietzsche, and I studied Kierkegaard to study Nietzsche, even though they're not in direct, conversation with each other during their lives.
Yeah.
It was to get around this idea that there is something to the Nietzschean critique of liberalism that I'm with you on. But there's also something I do think profoundly reactionary to parts of it. I don't think it can be reduced to simple fascism or regressive liberalism or even just an aristocratic bent. There's something more profound going on there.
Yeah.
Kierkegaard to me is more interesting for this because you could read Kierkegaard and other than his individualism, which in some ways seems out of you can accuse that of being a bourgeois subjectivity and thus liberal. It's not that he's anti-liberal. It's almost just absent. It's just not there. And I find that actually more fascinating and thought-provoking and problematizing. Right. How can you live in a Christian society that is clearly transitioning to modern liberal society and yet barely pick it up other than an individual focus that is enabled for you by that liberal society, but of which you're not really that invested or in any meaningful way for yourself. It's not like, I mean, Kierkegaard sees himself as a bourgeois subject.
No, certainly not. I mean, you have to remember this is someone who very conscientiously isolated himself from people. He had very few interpersonal relations. The great relation of his life, obviously, being Regine Olsen. He had a few correspondents, but I wouldn't describe him as someone who had friends. His main correspondents were with the phantom critics in his head. Part of his struggle as an author, he was certainly known about town, right? He was known as the eccentric feller, the author of either or, right? Even though he cloaked, not really cloaked, but kind of ironically distanced himself from his writings by this, a revolving series of pseudonyms. People knew who he was. He was recognizable. He was famously pilloried in a periodical, The Corsair, which actually was very psychologically devastating to him and kind of revived and his authorship and the purpose he saw for it. But he was someone who spent more than half his day in his room writing voluminously. And the people he corresponded with were largely in his head. That's part of his reason for elaborating these various pseudonyms, these imaginative constructions. He wants to bring forth personalities textually, right? And he wants to bring himself to the fore textually. But because he's not in direct contact with any human being, or very few, he has to achieve this through suggestion and irony. And irony, of course, is, saying one thing but meaning another in a very basic sense. So his textual play enacts the very social isolation and intentional social isolation that he actually lives. So you have to see in a very significant way his texts as his creations, as kind of this glimpse into his own inaccessible hidden interiority, which he writes so eloquently about. And he thinks everyone has this. And he thinks the ironic feature of this is that the interior of ourselves, the core of ourselves, is by nature inarticulable. It can't be communicated, right? But his whole authorship is devoted to this idea of communicating this very idea of the inarticulability of the self.
I mean, I think of two things. I mean, the obvious comparison to Nietzsche of the great existentialist is actually also that Nietzsche was pretty much a weirdo recluse who had a failed relationship and never really did anything else in regards to sociality. Yeah. I feel like Nietzsche was more of, to use a modern colloquial term, an incel than Kierkegaard, who just seems like love spurned and obsessed and asexual. Right? Like, like his relationship with Regine seems to be deep, sincere, and completely not about sexual reproduction whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, he in fact, he barely was able to like touch her hand. That is the most physical contact he ever writes about, is like brushing up against her hand. I mean, there is obviously repression in Nietzsche present as well, but I mean, you get a sense of sexual frustration in Nietzsche in a way that you don't at all from Kierkegaard. He has most effectively sublimated, or perhaps never had, because of his father, just this mangled sexual sense, this, this almost non-existence of his body, hence why he's so concerned about this like inarticulable interiority, the soul as the essence of who he is rather than the body. He just seems to have no relationship with the body. He avoids, will not find in a single journal entry, in a single letter, any crudities, right? You won't hear any mentions of expressions of affection of the body itself. I mean, it's all this ethereal stuff of the self. There's nothing bodily in Kierkegaard, and which is a great contrast to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is very much concerned with our embodiment and our animality. But for Kierkegaard, who perhaps had no real or no really developed sense of himself as an embodied human animal, it's just completely absent.
That's a fascinating problem to think about. I mean, just the lack of embodiment, which is, I mean, that is fundamentally different than most other existentialists who, where the existence coming before essence, to use Sartre's phraseology for what existentialism is very bodily, even for Nietzsche. Like Kierkegaard, I mean, I remember reading Either Or and like, this feels like an emo brain in a vat. Like,
I mean,
like,
no, that's accurate. And
go ahead.
I should attenuate my statement about having no relationship to the body. Kierkegaard, like Nietzsche, was a very sickly, frail person. He had a very weak constitution, particularly in his stomach, much like Nietzsche. And there's centuries of literature on the relationship between gastrointestinal disease and mental disturbance. Perhaps that's an avenue that's certainly been explored.
The person with gastrointestinal disease and may or may not have mental disturbance, I relate. So
yeah. So I mean, that's certainly a connection that's been explored in Nietzsche scholarship, but as far as I know, it's not something that has been much discussed about in Kierkegaard scholarship. I mean, part of the reason he doesn't really write about it, but like, I mean, it's known that he was unwell or prone to bouts of sickness, or that like a cold would put him out for a week. I mean, he does die very early, principally in his own account from the strain of like his task. He felt like he had reached an apotheosis in his writing, and he had done everything he wanted to, and at that point he just expired from exhaustion. Of course, that's not the official medical diagnosis, but you do see in Kierkegaard someone at odds. Maybe he's not have no relationship with his body, but he doesn't identify with it. It's weak. It fails him his entire life. It does nothing good for him.
And given how much of his family died, was that congenital? Like, do we know?
The various members of his family died under different circumstances. Some of a freak accident, but no, as far as I know, there's no suggestion of some kind of congenital illness that manifests in middle age that took them all. That does not seem to be the case. It does literally seem to be the case that he was a frail person his entire life, prone to severe bouts of illnesses, and at the point in which he died, he had been engaged in a radical campaign, basically burning all his bridges, all the people he had ever admired, ministers, philosophers, and just trying to take them all out. Literally trying to martyr himself for an idea, which is a theme in Kierkegaard. He, as a Christian, he has this motif of sacrifice or martyrdom becoming necessary in order to enact not only a transformation of consciousness but social transformation. So perhaps that is the end in terms of seeing Kierkegaard's politics. It's a politics of the necessary martyrdom of an individual to enact social transformation.
That's a hard sell on politics, to be completely fair.
Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, we're not
social transformation, but you must destroy yourself.
Well, it's not vague social transformation for Kierkegaard. I mean, his mission, which he proclaims in a series of articles called The Moment, is to wake people up of their complicity in a society that has become too comfortable in the belief that they are virtuous Christians, right? And he wants people to rethink what being a Christian would actually mean. Like, it's not just going to church every Sunday. It's not just attending mass. It's not just going through these social performances, right? And in this way, he's a great social critic. He's a great social critic of a certain bourgeois comfort, right? He wants to get people to re-examine the message of the gospel of Christ and what is required. And he sees that as a message that every individual must reckon with themselves. So that's the connection back to the individuality. So at the end of his life, he's not just trying to enact some kind of a vague gesture of social transformation. He's trying to break the spell of a certain bourgeois conformity, laziness, adherence to social norms, and get people to rethink the difficulty of living, and particularly the difficulty of living supposedly as a Christian, when we have all become Christians, when it's just become the part of the air we breathe. It's like, no, it's not like that. It clearly these people aren't really Christians. They're not people who are motivated by a passionate intensity. These people haven't really thought through their beliefs and what they entail. They are just part of a society that is roughly and disorganizedly organized around this vague sense of Christian values. But what does that even mean? So in that sense, he's a great reevaluator of values, like Nietzsche. He's trying to enact a rethinking of the received wisdom and values of his society.
Well, that leads me to, I think about that. It's something interesting about Kierkegaard, and that he takes his Christianity so seriously, although it is still a very Protestant, very post-liberal Christianity in a very stringent way. But he takes it like to the 9th degree in some way. I mean, for lack of a better term. And in a way, he calls out the bullshit on bourgeois interiority by actually trying to embody that interiority. Not that he would understand it as bourgeois, but so incredibly deeply that it almost becomes an auto-critique of the performativity, for lack of a better word, of bourgeois interiority. Does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of like, if I'm trying to read him in a more leftist mode, and take his work as emblematic of something, you know, that he also lived. It seems to me that like he's so bourgeois he can't be. Like, I don't know.
What I think you're on the right track. I mean, for you must understand that for Kierkegaard had two great models in his life: Socrates and Christ, right? And the Socratic element of Kierkegaard is that he sees himself like Socrates was for the men of Athens. He sees himself as a gadfly. He sees himself as someone questioning received wisdom, and through a performative, ironic authorship, he's gradually bringing to the fore the falsity of people's claims to know, right? But for him, the question is not to know like it was for Socrates. You know, Socrates was great insofar as he recognized his own ignorance, which of course is an ironic statement, right? Because, you know, Socrates is not completely ignorant. He couldn't, you know, that's just the ironic position he starts from in order to draw people out, to see if they actually do know something, right? So for Socrates, it was a question of exposing the falsity of beliefs or the lack of foundation for people's beliefs. For Kierkegaard, it's exposing the faithlessness amongst those who claim to have faith, right? He's the Christian Socrates, right? He's exposing the hollowness of the conventional understanding of what it means to faith, and he wants to make it difficult again.
Well, I mean, so I'm going to take off my Marxist hat, put it down, and I'm going to pick up my semi-amateur scholar of Hellenistic philosophy hat.
Sure.
Poop, flop it back on.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that, you know, his emulating of Socrates and Jesus, in this weird way, there's a third figure that emerges as a historical gap, because I think he historically influenced. I mean, I'm one of these people who think the Cynic movement actually had a lot of profound effect on early Christianity.
Yeah.
That Kierkegaard's like a antisocial Diogenes, but more Christian about it, which he was probably way more neurotic and anxiety driven, and way less given to stuff like calling people into hypocrisy by performative masturbation. Right. But nonetheless, it does seem like that's part of what he's trying to do. And we always have to remember that, like, the Cynics come from the Stoics. They're radical development out of the Stoics, and the Stoics themselves are a radical development out of the Socratic tradition. Like, there's a direct line. I mean, there's other stuff involved. There's weird metaphysics involved, but like, there's a direct line there. And it does seem like in some ways, more than Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche was way more into Hellenistic, Socratic and pre-Socratic philosophy. that in some ways that Kierkegaard is actually almost like a throwback to that. I mean, what do you make of that reading? Like this idea that you embody your philosophy to the point that it kind of destroys you, but also it's to point out how hypocritical and unwise so much of this stuff actually is, and for him it's be unfaithful.
I'll be honest, I had never made that connection before. I mean, he doesn't really speak of Diogenes in particular, or Stoicism. I mean, certainly there are stoical elements to how he actually lived his life, and to the extent to which he gives prescriptions for living, that there is a continuity with Stoicism. But I really do think we have to take him seriously as this Socratic figure, because I've mentioned before he was a well-known figure about town. And much like Socrates did in Athens, he would engage people in conversations, in kind of a question and answer form. Like he tried to emulate in conversation the Socratic method, but he also introduces, from his understanding of Socratic irony, a new kind of performative textual irony, because Socrates primarily philosophized through speech, right? And Kierkegaard, because he's so isolated, he has to, or wants to, perform a similar function through textual play and through pseudonymous distancing, and he wants to force the same kind of midwifery of the idea that Socrates describes his own philosophical method as aimed at. And he wants to do that through having each reader, the singular individual, which he writes about, his reader, that's more of a Nietzschean phrase, my reader. But Kierkegaard is inclined to say things like that as well, but it usually comes out as the singular individual, the one who my entire authorship is directed at. He wants each individual to encounter his texts and decide for themselves amongst these competing life views that are represented through the various interplay of pseudonyms and the thick layers of parody and irony and just like seemingly tangential remarks, right? Like that all is there to, as he says in Repetition, make it difficult for the heretics to understand, right? He writes in a deliberately evasive way, which seemingly makes it difficult to say what his positive philosophy is, what his positive beliefs, whether he actually considered himself a Christian. That is a big question in Kierkegaard scholarship. Did Kierkegaard himself consider himself a Christian, or did he see that as his life task, as expressed in his authorship? Not only to make other people realize the difficulty of becoming a Christian, but express the fact that he was not yet sure that he had become a Christian. So as far I see him as a Socratic figure. I see him as a midwifery for as a midwife for the faithful, or for those who claim to have faith. And I also see the continuity with the oracle's proclamation to know thyself, right? I mean, it's kind of a radicalization of that starting point of Western philosophy, that knowledge begins with self-knowledge. So I read him Socratically. I don't. I mean, it's interesting to think about these later figures or later followers of Socrates, but I think Socrates is primary, and I think the actual work is Socratic in spirit.
I could agree with that, although I think my point is not so much that I thought that Kierkegaard would be influenced by Hellenistic philosophers. I, like you, have not found the shred of evidence that he even read them. But more that the Christianity part of it and the Socratic part of it actually do probably bring some of these more ancient Hellenistic philosophies to bear, just because you're dealing with these intersections that happened anciently. And in that, I mean, I find that interesting because that means that there is something to the idea that
well, you can't really
Kierkegaard,
you can't really
Mhm.
separate Hellenistic philosophy from Christian theology. I
No,
mean,
you can't.
the whole project of the Middle Ages was to reconcile the wisdom of the ancient philosophers with, you know, divinely received or divinely inspired texts. Like, how do we reconcile the Gospels with what Plato says? Right. I mean,
Right.
ultimately, they end up favoring Plato. So, in a sense, Christian theology is both Hellenistic and something else.
Right. I mean, like middle and high Platonism are all over medieval Christian theology,
Yeah.
and thus they survive into the modern world through Christian and Islamic mysticism as much as through scholastics.
Yeah.
But I find that interesting. I mean, to me, Kierkegaard's actually a good reason to take theology, even if you're an atheist.
Yeah.
Or secular or whatever, to take theology very seriously. I think Hegel is actually another reason. I am one of the people who will tell you when people try to tell me you can read Hegel without theology, I kind of laugh at them. I mean, I just think like, no, man, everything in the phenomenology and most of the stuff in the logic's a pun. And it reads, and I mean that not in that it's a joke, but that everything reads both as a logical statement and a theological statement simultaneously, and that's on purpose.
Yeah.
Like, go ahead.
You're certainly not the first to suggest that. I mean, you might think that our whole society as it stands today is hopelessly mired in theological presuppositions, right? That our
Right.
politics are inherently theological, that they presuppose a cosmological view of the universe itself. I mean, and I think that's true. And the question is like, are we okay with that? Are, is there something about theology that's inescapable, or is theology the problem? I mean, certainly this is in a broad sense, the question that we've been grappling with since the Enlightenment. You know, whether to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? If our whole society is premised on certain like theological conceptions of human beings and our role in the world, in relation to some divine purpose or plan, even if we secularize that, even if we deify that as reason and virtue, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we really haven't gotten that far away from theology. We've just we're quibbling over semantics.
Well, I mean, yes, we've talked about my love of Lester McIntyre, and I think this brings me to another place where I find Kierkegaard so fucking interesting. Is that there are you're right, there are political notions in his vision. There kind of has to be, but they're political notions in the way that like anti-politics is political. It is a rejection of the false promise of politics, and a lot of people would see that as reactionary. I don't inherently see that as reactionary. I think it can become reactionary very easily. I mean, I think of someone like Gomez de Villa or someone like that who, you know, is a quietist about almost everything, but is clearly a hyper reactionary. For those of you who don't know, he wrote a bunch of very snarky quotes inspired by Nietzsche, but was also a super Christian and a weirdo. But what I find interesting about de Villa versus, say, someone like Kierkegaard, de Villa is still explicitly political. I mean, even though his anti-politics is an anti-politics, it's a political anti-politics. It is aimed against leftism primarily, and then sees conservatism and reactionaryism as actually conceding to the false political promises of leftism in some way or another. And the only way to be truly reactionary is just go do the Plato thing and contemplate perfection in your library away from every fucking body. Right. That's his conservative vision, but it is a conservative vision. I don't think that I could say that even though I see some of that in Kierkegaard, I don't think his vision is conservative. It's like almost so Christian, it's almost alien to modern politics. What do you make of that reading?
I don't think Kierkegaard is advising anyone to live in the way he did. I don't think he's advising anyone to devote their entire life to the exclusion of sexuality and romance, to being a philosopher or a theologian or a social critic. All he's saying is that choose. Whatever you do, make a decision about who you want to be and see if you can make that, if you can project that into the future. See if you can live with the decisions you have made. He's in that sense very much concerned with all of our historical circumstances. Right? We are both burdened by the past and terrified of the future. How do we reconcile this contradiction of feeling weighed down by what has been and uncertain about an unknowable future? Well, for Kierkegaard, it starts with the individual deciding for themselves the type of life they want to lead, what they're willing to stake their life on, right? The idea. And there's admittedly a kind of Platonic reactionary reading of this, that we should stake everything for the sake of giving birth to this perfect idea or ideal. But at the same time, this task is different for everyone, and it must be decided on a different basis with different consequences for every individual. Kierkegaard is in no way saying that he's living an exemplary life or the model of a philosophical life. He's principally concerned with the task of freedom. And the task of freedom is the ability to will not only this moment, but the next, and what will become of oneself, and whether one can live with that.
I guess this is maybe leads me to the end of this discussion, and maybe to get into some of the finer points of Kierkegaardian philosophy. Like, one of the things I find so fascinating about Kierkegaard is he's not a non-dualist in the normal like dharmic religion sense, but he also is a non-dualist. Like, he really wants to get past either or binaries and move past that. I mean, literally that's the ending to either or, and that's the text by him. I admit that I know either or and Feel and Trembling. Those are the two I know the best. I guess
read Repetition or listen to our episode coming out.
All right. And I think there's something interesting about his attempt to get beyond these binaries. Through ethical encumbrance, it sees a lot of these binary choices as a fundamentally socially inscribed false choices, and that until we can get beyond them, and he's very clear that he doesn't necessarily have an easy way to get beyond them. There's no like clear even ethical program for exactly how to do that, but that seems to be what he's aiming at. So what do you make about that, and how does that tie into his concept of anxiety and repetition and difference? These are all very important themes in Kierkegaard get picked up later in like post-structuralist philosophy, for example.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's accurate to say that he wants to deny false binaries. I mean, he sees life as a confrontation, right? As full of these kind of contradictions or competing claims made against us. Claims from the ethical sphere, claims drawn from like social expectation and Sittlichkeit, social morality, and the claims that come from within, from the sense of a passionate purpose, right? So I think the principal collision he sees is between the kind of aesthetic the reflective aesthetic position where you are merely trying to increase variety of experiences while making no real commitments or ensnaring yourself in social obligations, right? Just kind of being in the world but above it. And the demands that immediately confronts one when you're engaged in any kind of interpersonal interaction, whether that's with your friends or your communities, your comrades, or with the relationship between a citizen and their government, right? Or our obligations to uh, each other in terms of like being citizens of the world or being human beings. So I see that the either or is rejected insofar as that these claims do have are compelling to us. Like we are compelled by like aesthetic temptations, and we are compelled by ethical demands. But there's this third element, what Hegel would call mediation, which he wants to call repetition, that allows us not to reconcile the contradictions, not to sublate them, but will the same, but with a difference, right? So for Kierkegaard, the Hegelian concept of mediation is inadequate because it's stuck merely in the conceptual world, right? It's something a kind of movement that takes place purely in logic, in the play of ideas, while ignoring what's on the ground, which is actual existing fucking human beings who are confronted with dilemmas in which they're forced to make choices, right? And he sees repetition as the kind of corresponding ontological, existential version of mediation that doesn't require this kind of third term, but is um, is transformed through everything that has come before. Instead of like something new emerging from it, right? Something does emerge that is new, but it's something that cannot be anticipated, right? It's not like a clashing of thesis and antithesis, but it's more the conscientious willing of the same as my as the product of my choice, of my choosing, right? And the fact that it's the product of my choice and choosing is what makes the difference, right? Is what transforms what has been into what will be, right? So, unlike the flaneur-like aesthete who goes from one experience to the next, whether it's the experience of seduction or it's the rapturous experience of a masterful theatrical performance, or it's the writing of poetry, and just depends upon a variety of experiences in order to like make their life feel whole. The one who wills repetition in many ways wills one thing, right? They will what they've committed themselves to. They will the choices they have made, and they will the person they will become because of their choices.
Now, how does this tie into anxiety?
Yes, you did ask that. So for Kierkegaard, the experience of anxiety is kind of much like the experience of despair, and they are related concepts. Are these experiences that come when we are in places of transition between aesthetic, ethical, and this idea of this religious stage of existence. We despair or we feel anxiety when we recognize the groundlessness of our existence, right? So for the aesthete, for the reflective aesthete, who is dependent upon a variety of different experiences in order to make their life feel whole, the transitional phase to a more ethical life view, which depends upon making commitments and willing that we have certain obligations to others, and as opposed to just kind of, you know, floating from one experience to the next, and leaving, people in our wake with no sense of responsibility or obligation to them. The feeling of despair and anxiety is that recognition um, of the lack of foundation in our lives, the insufficiency of our becoming.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess that leads us to repetition, a theme for these early existentialists. Nietzsche was also obsessed with it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of convergence, because I think there are overlaps in the concept, or Kierkegaard's concept, of repetition and eternal return, but I think they have different things in mind. I think repetition for Kierkegaard is a psychological prophylactic, right? It's something to gird yourself for the task of living, and it's also an ontological claim, right? About the nature of becoming, and what becoming requires for people endowed with self-consciousness, and who have to reason about what they are to do. Whereas the eternal recurrence, it's been read a variety of ways. If you know, it's been read as kind of a psychological prophylactic, something, a myth, something that is a litmus test for the future philosophers, or that Nietzsche envisions, like whether you can hold this thought, that you would will that everything that has ever happened to you, all the pain, all the suffering, all the pleasure, all the joy, all of it, whether you would will for it to return to you eternally, whether you can hold fast to this thought and affirm it as a kind of psychological test for a new brand of philosophers, or perhaps a new kind of political animal. It's been read that way. Or whether it is a cosmological principle that Nietzsche really believed that he had some kind of mystical experience in which it was revealed to him that, as a matter of cosmological fact, that existence does work that way, that it does eternally return to us. I don't think that kind of cosmology is present in Kierkegaard, like it potentially is present in Nietzsche. But the common thread is that both are highlighting the role of a conscientious willing in the determination of whether a life is bearable, or, more importantly, is meaningful. So I would read both the eternal recurrence and repetition as a prescription for a human determined or enacted meaning.
All right. I mean, I think it's interesting because we have to get in. I think people don't realize how fucking weird Nietzsche is. Like, once if you've actually read Das Zarathustra and not read like a gloss on it, you're like, no, this is wild.
Yeah.
And and also, like, sometimes I think people are taking him metaphorically. I'm like, no, I think he might actually mean that literally. We don't have that problem with Kierkegaard because we know it was a religious mystic, basically, and unlike Nietzsche,
we know he was very concerned with a certain kind of religiosity, and he saw that the religious orientation as the the highest form of self-consciousness. And I don't think Nietzsche would agree with that per se.
Oh,
But,
like at all.
but I mean, there certainly is a shared kind of mystical vision in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. It's just that in Kierkegaard, it gets translated in Platonic Christian terms, and Nietzsche devotes his entire philosophical project to the
destruction of both.
the destruction of both. Yes, yes.
I mean, he's basically at war with both Plato and Socrates and
Yeah.
Jesus. I mean, it's interesting that there's so many. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about the origins of existentialism is you have your two key figures, the proto-existentialists, and their Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and they rhyme so much. They're both very interior. They're both very active psychologists, but
Yep.
their philosophical projects, with the exception that they're both opposed to Hegelian systematization and abstraction, would
Yeah.
also be diametrically opposed to each other. Like, and I
don't-
find that fascinating.
I don't know if they're diametrically opposed. I like I said, like it does matter in the end whether we read Kierkegaard's Christianity as extractable from his philosophical vision, like just something that we'd like to like close our eyes to, or whether we can't really, in a systematic way, ironically, and I think there is something systematic to Kierkegaard's vision, despite himself. Yeah, the question will be like whether his philosophy lends itself best to a Christian theological vision, or whether what is valuable and lasting in it is amenable to secularization. I think it's explicit in Nietzsche that he wants to excise all the what he sees as unhealthy outgrowths of Western's philosophies, I don't know, usurpation of by Christianity. He wants to just kind of, well, not erase it, but overcome it, right? It's something go beyond it. Whereas Kierkegaard is very comfortable in that space, but they both arrive at, as you've already said, this vision of philosophy as a task for the individual that foregrounds the role of will and the power of self-creation.
I guess that leads me in an interesting space, because on one hand, I do think I've listened to your show about this. I've actually been like, oh, I should go back and read Kierkegaard again. Maybe I won't treat him as a religious weirdo. And because I remember actually loving reading Kierkegaard when I read him 20 years ago. I thought it was great to read. I don't remember, however, like being very systemic about it, being very organized about it, and also being this is really fun to read. But it's like reading a more paying Christian Bataille. In that I find that really fun to read too. But I don't take a whole lot that I can apply from it.
Right.
And so, but I your episodes on this and our discussion today makes me think maybe there is more to going back and thinking about this influence of anxiety and this kind of existential philosophicalization about what our interior processes. And one of the things I think about that is because I think, the left are maybe philosophy, big TMs behind it, and with all the appropriate scare quotes, has moved away from dealing with that interiority. We've gone back to system building land. And sometimes I do think, even when I deal with someone like Miguel Bakhtin or someone like that, Soviet, very influenced by Hegel, dialectics, Marx, all that, but has actually a critique of over-relying on the dialectic because it's too abstract.
Yeah.
That even the multiple voices and polyvocality and all that fun stuff is actually rooted in specific human relationships that, yes, you can abstract in a dialectical way and learn stuff about and through the movement of history, and you should, but it's wrong to treat everything that way. That misses something fundamental about the nature of those interactions. And I think something, the existentialist philosophers really do challenge us to put that like commitment to some kind of meaning norm, and norm here not just in the ethical sense, but in like the about almost in also an aesthetic, in a we have the capacity to interpret this as meaningful in a normative way, but that is an act of will. It is not innate. And to get a little bit back to that, because I think not only has the left gotten away from that, art, philosophy, and that's an even bigger abstraction, has gotten away from that. But I think about like ethics today, like the existentialists are not moral realists in that they don't really think morality inherently emerges from the physical world in a universal and consistent way, right? That's part of their gambit in a way. Maybe there are some moral realist existentialists, but I don't really know how you square that with fundamental propositions of existentialism.
I think it'd be very strange. Yeah. I can't, I mean, Kierkegaard is actually a kind of moral realist, but it only emerges when you realize that he sees that he bifurcates the ethical from religious inwardness, right? He thinks the ethical, or as he says in a very Hegelian fashion, the universal makes demands upon us, but it's through the conflict or struggle with the individual, the particular, that the universal has validity, right? So it's there's a dialectic to our relationship to ethical demands, right? And Kierkegaard is certainly, well, he certainly believes in something like divine command theory, right? Because he lauds figures like Abraham and Job, who have this direct confrontation with God, trial with God, that they can't really communicate or justify to anyone, and they act on the basis of their understanding of this divine will and command. And I won't get into how that's not really moral realism, but like in theological circles, that's what grounds morality, is that it's an expression of God's will or his divine commands, right? That's what makes it real. So no, I think it's very difficult to map on existentialism to an analytical metaethical category like moral realism. If you had to, if you were going to force it, you would say that existentialism is a realist construal of ethics in terms of social construction, right? You can think of the
Right.
development or origin of moral norms in terms of intersubjective interaction and agreement upon time, uh, around certain sets of behaviors and rules around them, right? It's constructed over time. It's a historical product. And of course, that's not the kind of realism that I have from time to time been known to advocate. But it certainly seems to be what existentialism leads to. It leads to this human focus, um, task of constructing meaning on the basis of our free choices.
which would be like, say, the opposite of evolutionary emergent moral realism, which is probably the vogue right now in analytic circles. Well, in some of them anyway. I
Well,
actually
I
think
mean,
it might be
yeah,
out of vogue in some of them too.
you're talking about ethical naturalism, and of course that's one version of moral realism, is that we can reduce our moral norms to some kind of evolutionary selection for cooperative human behavior or something like that, right? We can understand the voice in our head that says one ought not to lie in terms of the socially conducive effects of keeping your promises, right? That's kind of a naturalistic view of the origin of moral norms, and they're real insofar as they are reducible to certain natural categories, right? That. But that's not something that really. I mean, it's kind of a kind of ethical naturalism, the existentialism, because both focus on human sociality and some idea about what the innate tendencies of, or the evolved tendencies of human nature are, and the sort of things that we desire and want, right? We want meaning. Why do we want meaning? Because we want to form some kind of unity to our lives in order to, reach some destination where we are, I mean, from biological standpoint, where we live long enough to survive and reproduce. But of course, like, that's not satisfactory. We don't all care about, just surviving long enough to reproduce. I think the existentialist approach to ethics moves beyond kind of that vulgar evolutionary reductionism, because clearly the meaning of life for many people doesn't revolve around the perpetuation of the species. I mean, some people will never even think about that.
No, I mean, the number of childless people indicate that even if they're right, it doesn't apply one to one. It can only apply in aggregate.
Yeah.
Right.
I am one of those childless cat persons. I am proudly so.
Yeah. Yeah. I also do not have children. I take care of other people's children, so I guess in some ways I still live up to my evolutionary perspective, but I don't think that's why I do it.
I mean, you're doing praxis. You're doing post-family praxis, right?
Yeah.
Right? You're raising.
I do talk about liking being an allo parent, which is also historically the norm too. Actually.
Yeah, and it still is in impoverished or economically undeveloped countries. It's the norm by necessity, right?
Even as a foreigner, when I lived in Egypt in particular, but a little bit so when I lived in Mexico, I was actually kind of surprised how comfortable people were with like kids just hanging out with me.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, come up and talk to me for 15 minutes in front of their parents. There was nothing considered weird about that at all. And I'm like, I mean, if nothing else, they were, like, oh, we're practicing English and you're practicing your really, 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 really shitty Arabic that you don't really have.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a vastly different atmosphere. And you're right. Some of it's by necessity. Some of it's that certain kinds of cultural relations have not been marketized to the point that they have been here.
Right.
And I also don't want to romanticize that, but I do think we have to think about this. I mean, I like existentialism for the fact that it is a essentially ethical proposition, but it's one that goes in so many different ways in the creation of meaning. Whereas I'll be quite frank with you. I find a lot of moral naturalism, which I don't know is the primary form of moral realism coming out of analytic philosophy, but it is the most annoying and loudest.
Well, it has the most scientific respectability, right?
Right.
And that's huge. That's huge for analytics, right? I mean, the trend since mid-century in analytic philosophy is to basically transform the philosophy department into the physics department, right? To close the gaps between this, last vestige of like humanity's bullshit and make it objective and scientific, which of course is ridiculous. But.
Yeah, I'll tell you the one time, and as another defensive existentialist, I went to a narratology conference, which is also something I don't necessarily advise people doing. Back when I was still a professor, back in those days of my life.
Yeah.
And it was about 15 years ago. And it's back when people were trying to do the markets are evolutionary, and also narrative is evolutionary. And so I was listening to humanities majors divvying up psychological eye movement reports from the 1950s to try to come up with theories about the length of narrative, and me just going, you realize, I consider myself a pro-science person, but I was like, you realize this is bullshit, right? Like, it's like, this is all metaphorical. You seem like this is a step over memetics, which is also a nonsense pseudoscientific thing based off of a fucking metaphor, literally based off a metaphor, actually, in that case. And when I go back and read Existentialist, I'm like, no, there's something actually respectable about being honest, that you can't actually, that there is some truth to the inability to totally derive an is from an ought. And that makes analytics, I'll be honest, it also makes Marxists uncomfortable. Like, I think
it's strange to me. I mean, like, I don't know what Marx they're reading, but like the is ought gap does not exist for Marx.
No, not at all.
He's not working purely from descriptive premises. Like his descriptive premises are always impregnated by a vision of social transformation. It's just I partly know where this anti moralism, or really it's anti-ethic. I mean, of course, Marx is a great critic of moralism and the political inefficacy of mere moralism, of just pure moral suasion. But that's different from the question of whether Marx is merely dispassionately describing historical transformations in the means of production. Of course, he's not just doing that, because what would be the fucking point? Why would we even care? Right? I mean, like if he was just describing, like, I mean, how can you describe like capital as like a vampire that sucks the blood from labor dispassionately? You're telling me that's not a moral prescription or a moral judgment on the nature of capitalist exploitation? Get the fuck out of here. It's absurd.
Right. Well, I mean, I do think we have to take seriously that Marx is having his cake and eating it too, in a way that a lot of people who both are post-German idealist and actual German idealist did, where they were trying to be like, we can't abide by this Humean English bullshit. We must come up with a way that the ought and the is are reconcilable.
Right.
So, but well, I'm not always convinced they succeed either.
No, I mean, it's always just seemed intuitively obvious to me that any description of the world is going to presuppose some kind of normative of vision, right? Like the world is just normatively laden, even in our best attempts to be some kind of godlike third person objective spectator. We can't.
This is why empiricism doesn't actually work, because usually there's norms hidden in your descriptors that color your empirical descriptions. And I think, I like to give Zizek shit, but he actually talks about this. The empiricists tended to be more to reproduce the biases of their society, sexism, racism, whatever, even when they were trying not to, largely because it was already in their descriptors. Like, and thus it's hidden in their norms in a way that makes it seem like it's objectively scientific and isn't. And I think we also, I mean, like, you want to get into more advanced ways that this comes up. Think about like how machine learning and AI replicate social biases as if they're objective facts, because the social biases are reflected in the statistics and thus they reinforce each other.
Yeah.
That even trying to move it into pure mathematics doesn't get out of that normative lens, because how we're counting what counts in what category of the math is still actually a qualitative judgment, not a quantitative one.
I think this takes us nicely back to one of the unsung advantages of existentialism, that it doesn't presuppose this descriptive prescriptive gap at all. In fact, it begins with us, with internal experience, with human psychology, with the phenomenology of being in the world, right? Which, because we are meaning rapacious animals, is incredibly normative related. It begins with the question of, it's like, what is meaningful, or how do I make my life meaningful, right? That's the first philosophy of the existentialists. Not what is, but what is meaningful. Is meaning possible? And that's a normative question.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point to end up on. Thank you, Charles. You and Devin will probably be semi-regular guests on my show whenever I need to talk about philosophy, because that's what I started out doing many years ago, talking about left philosophy before I became an Assart's Marx scholar, which I say with both love and utter contempt. Thank
you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about Kierkegaard. I could do it all day long. I don't see a lot of podcasts, political or philosophical, covering Kierkegaard.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Besides my own and now yours. So I thank you for giving me a platform for that, and I hope people are inspired to read Kierkegaard and not dismiss him as some eccentric, asexual Christian theologian, because I think he's much more than that.
Yeah, I kind of agree. And also, even if he wasn't a eccentric, asexual Christian theologian, some of those guys are actually interesting. So
very true.
All right. I'm like, I actually get a weird amount out of reading Thomas Aquinas. So it's
me too.
It's very strange. All right.